Tonight, we will hear the 11th Tansley Lecture, and this annual event is called the Tansley Lecture to honor the late Donald Tansley for his remarkable career as a senior public servant in Canada. Donald Tansley, alumnus of the University of Saskatchewan, began his career with the government of Saskatchewan in the Budget Bureau under the guidance of Al Johnson. And throughout his career, Tansley was known for leading some of the most complex and contentious files in provincial government, rescuing IPSCO from bankruptcy, implementing Medicare in Saskatchewan, modernizing the New Brunswick provincial government, and implementing the program of equal opportunity were just some of the challenges he accepted. Following Tansley's time in New Brunswick, he moved to the Federal Public Service, where he held many important posts: Vice President of the Canadian International Development Agency, Advisor to the Red Cross, CEO of the Anti-Inflation Board, and he led the development of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans as Deputy Minister. Whatever the challenge, Donald Tansley's character and commitment to the public service shone brightly. He could often be heard encouraging his colleagues to persevere, to find the strength to get the job done, and to take harsh judgments with a grain of salt. Values perhaps shared with tonight's distinguished speaker, the Honourable Preston Manning. Mr. Preston Manning is founder and president of the Manning Centre for Building Democracy, which he founded in 2005. He's a senior fellow of the Fraser Institute and the Marketplace Institute at Regent College, University of British Columbia. Mr. Manning served as a member of Parliament from 1993 to 2001, where he founded two new political parties, the Reform Party of Canada and the Canadian Reform Conservative Alliance, both of which became official opposition in Parliament, and both of which laid the foundation for the new Conservative Party of Canada. Mr. Manning served as leader of the official opposition from 1997 to 2000 and was his party's science and technology critic. In 2007, he was made a Companion of the Order of Canada, and in 2013 appointed to the Privy Council. Mr. Manning graduated from the University of Alberta with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and was engaged in the provision of consulting services to the energy industry for 20 years before entering the political arena. And he has received many honorary degrees, including from University of Calgary, University of Alberta, Southern Alberta Institute of Technology, Tyndale University College, York University, and the University of Toronto. And we're looking forward to the insights and expertise he will share with us. Please join me in welcoming the Honourable Preston Manning.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I want to say thank you to the Johnson Shoyama Business School for this event and for allowing me to talk to you. If you haven't finished your dessert, go ahead and do it. I'm used to speaking in the House of Commons where people didn't pay attention at all, so that won't bother me if you're doing something else besides listening to me. I should mention my Saskatchewan connection. My grandfather homesteaded in Rosetown, Saskatchewan. My dad was raised on a homestead in that area. So our family has a Western background, both geographically and politically. And the thoughts I'd like to share with you tonight are suggested by one of the iconic figures of the West, and that is the Scout. And the job of the Scout, and I think of people like Jerry Potts, the great Métis Scout that was the chief scout of the Northwest Mounted Police, and including when they first came here to the Cypress Hills in Saskatchewan. And the job of the Scout, of course, was to ride out ahead of the main company and to see if there was danger or if there was opportunities. But the hardest part of the Scout's job was to come back to the company that had not been over the next hill or around the next bend in the river and convince them that if we go this way, we'll be safe. If we go that way, we'll be in danger. And what I'd like to do tonight is to imagine that we are in that scouting position, the modern equivalence of Jerry Potts, scouting Saskatchewan's frontiers of the future, the political frontier, which embraces both the economic and the social, but also the environmental frontier, the resource frontier, the technological frontier, the international frontier, because they're all related. And to think a little bit about what dangers do we see, what opportunities do we see, and how is it best to communicate, particularly to the public, what those dangers or those opportunities might be. And I'm going to talk for a little while on maybe 3 of these frontiers, and I'd like you to think about questions. I do a lot of work with young people who tell me the days of the 45-minute speech that you used to give are over. You're lucky to get a 15-minute one. But have lots of room for interaction and question. That way I can ascertain where your heads are at and respond to it. So I'll talk for a little while, then we'd like to get some questions from you, and I'll mention the other frontiers that I could say more about, and if that's where you're interested in, you let me know. But maybe I'll start on a historical note again on the political frontier. My dad, as I mentioned, was raised on his homestead in Saskatchewan. He and his brother put together a crystal radio set in the 1920s when radio was just getting started. And one of the first radio broadcasts he heard was William Eberhard, who pioneered religious radio broadcasting in Western Canada. And Eberhard had an institute in Calgary, and my father, by listening to him, decided he wanted to go into the Christian ministry, and so he went to Calgary and studied at this institute. Eberhard had a soup kitchen at that institute in the Depression, and started to see in the lineups by his soup kitchen people that he'd sent off to be doctors and teachers, people riding the rails trying to look for work. And he got very interested in this social credit idea, which was sort of a poor man's Keynesian economics, that if you could print money, if you primed the pump, as long as you didn't do it to an inflationary degree, you could stimulate the economy. He started to talk about this on his radio program. And people started to form study groups in Alberta around this social credit concept. Eberhard thought of himself as an educator, not as a political guy, but these study groups decided to run candidates in the 1935 election against Eberhard's judgment. My father was one of them. And that election in Alberta, they threw every last member of the farmers' government out of office, the premier, every cabinet minister, and every MLA, and they replaced them with these other people. My dad said all you had to be able to tell the electors in the 35 election was to promise or to tell them that you had never ever set foot in the legislature before. And that was enough to get you. But anyway, I tell you that, so he became a cabinet minister at the age of 26. So he's one of the youngest, in fact, the youngest cabinet minister in the Commonwealth at that time. And I guess because Eberhard thought he was a young guy, he assigned to him the oldest deputy. So I know there's deputy ministers here, so Eberhard valued the experience that you bring to the political side. And this fellow's name was Eddie Trowbridge, and Trowbridge was in his early 60s by that time. Trowbridge had been a clerk for F.W.G. Haltane, the last great premier of the old Northwest Territory when the West was one big territory. And Trowbridge had known every premier of Saskatchewan and Alberta from 1905 to 1935. And he never tired telling my father, even when my father became premier, that he wasn't a bad premier, Trowbridge said, but the best premier that the West ever had was F.W.G. Haltane. Now, Haltane ended up, as some of you might know, as the Chief Justice of Saskatchewan, I think the first Chief Justice. But on December 18, 1901, Haltane had a debate in Indian Head, Saskatchewan. It was attended, apparently, though it was December, by over 1,500 people. They had to come in sleighs and horses. That's a big crowd in that day to come to a political meeting. And what the meeting was about was a debate between Haltane and Rodman Roblin, the first premier of Manitoba, Duff Roblin's grandfather, who was the premier of Manitoba when it was that postage stamp province. It didn't go all the way to Hudson Bay. And the debate was over. Haltane argued that the West should remain as one big province with one law for everybody in the West, that it should have the ownership of its natural resources, and it should have constitutional equality with Quebec and Ontario. I mean, this guy was 110 years ahead of his time. You can see why I like Haltane. But the issue that I think that he raised, and what he labeled Rodman, he says, you are a little Westerner. You want to allow the federal government you want to carve up the West into small pieces so that you can have a jurisdiction over which you have authority. And the alternative is the big Westerner. And he challenged his audience, are we little Westerners? Are we big Westerners? And I actually think that's a relevant question today. I use a historic example. But we're headed into a period where the increasingly protectionism is being adopted by every province, sometimes as a defensive mechanism, not because they want to. And I think we're going to have to decide one of the issues on the trade frontier for the West and for Canada as a whole is, are we going to be little Westerners or are we going to be big Westerners? Are we going to carve up our jurisdictions with trade barriers and subsidies that differentiate the provinces one from another? Are we going to become economic separatists, if not political separatists? Or are we going to be big Westerners, endeavor to try to recreate that freer trade environment, that bigger unified environment that Haultain talked about? And I do wonder, as you know, a few years ago, the Western provinces negotiated this New West trade agreement among themselves, which was an attempt to make sure that we had a unified trading unit, at least among ourselves. That's all gone, that's hardly operable today. The dispute settling mechanism has not been used, even though it might be relevant to this pipeline dispute between Alberta and British Columbia. So I leave that with you as one issue. If there's anybody here who has an answer to that question as to are we going to be big Westerners or little Westerners, are we going to be protectionists, are we going to be free traders, that I think is one of the things that we have to decide, and it's going to be a political debate going on into the future. Still on that economic frontier, a second danger that I see, and I see this more from our federal political people and commentators, is this tendency to devalue and almost demean the natural resource sectors. There is an old model, and I talked about this a little bit earlier with some of the staff and the deputy ministers. There is an old model of the economy that is in the heads of my generation, but it still persists in many quarters, that envisions the economy with the natural resource sectors down in the basement. And we're kind of, people are apologetic for them, they chop down trees and they dig holes and they disturb the soil. And then there's the more respectable manufacturing sector on the main floor. And then there's the service sector, and then there's the knowledge sector, which is the penthouse, and we're all trying to get to the penthouse. I think there's a better model than that ought to be championed. That the natural resource sectors are fundamental building blocks of the economy and are fundamental to the success of those other sectors. I would like to see somebody, I have academic friends, somebody's got to do this, I don't know how to do it. Somebody's got to cut that pyramid the other way. Identify what is the contribution to the GDP. In your case, let's say the agricultural resource sector. What is the contribution of the agricultural manufacturing sector? Manufacturing that would not exist if it wasn't for that resource base. What is the agricultural service sector? What is the agricultural knowledge sector? And what is that total contribution by agriculture, by fishery, by forestry, by mining, and by energy? And I think if you had that model, you could make the case that these resource sectors are fundamental to the success of the Canadian economy. If you have the second largest country on the face of the earth, that means by definition you have the second largest stock of natural resources in the world. And rather than apologizing for it, saying, I hope we can get beyond the resource economy, making it a fundamental, recognizing it as a fundamental element of our economy. I could go on this a little bit, but I was saying to somebody today that I was on an airplane I ended up sitting beside an executive with the John Deere company. And he said to me, he says, within X years, the biggest single asset of John Deere will not be those green machines or the factories for producing them. It will be that database that is being collected by a GPS-connected monitor on every combine, every drill across the country. Now, what is that? The economists would say that database and the information mining of it belongs to the knowledge industry or the service industry. No, but it wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the resource base down beneath. Why does Calgary have the highest per capita computer capacity of any city, or one of the highest capacities of any city in North America, except Houston? And why Calgary and Houston? Because those oil patch guys need computer capacity, vast computer capacity to process reservoir analysis. But so, like, you can think of it, well, it's a knowledge industry thing, it's an information thing, it's a service thing. Yeah, but it's there because the oil patch is there, and that's why it's in Texas. And so I'm, again, looking at that frontier. I think there's a danger of our natural resource sectors being underappreciated, underrepresented, and somebody got to champion them as fundamental building blocks of the economy of the future. Still on the political frontier, and I had questions on this a little bit earlier in the day, we have to be cognizant of the populist phenomena that is existent in many countries today. The Brexit vote, the election of Trump. Populism is a force, and many people are worried about whether it's a negative force that can be destructive. And so I'd like to say a little bit about that. My own view is that we should start by looking at populism in a neutral sense, that it's a democratic phenomena that can occur in free societies. It represents a lot of political energy, but boiling up from the bottom. And so it has some potential, but it can go the wrong way. It can turn into a disaster, depending on the leadership and the character of it, or it can be harnessed to constructive purposes. And it seems to me that this is something that the West has had more, in Canada, the part of the country that has more experience with populism than any other part is this part of the country. The Progressive Party that bred the old Farmers' Party in the 1920s was a populist movement. It was a bottom-up movement. The Depression parties, the CCF in this province and Social Credit in Alberta, were bottom-up movements. They had a populist dimension to them. The Reform was in part a populist-type movement. And the challenge with populism is I think, to recognize what's ever causing that energy to boil up from the bottom, the anger and the emotion that's connected with it, to recognize it, to connect with it, but then try to channel it in a way that is constructive rather than destructive. And whether you go along with what Reform tried to do in the late 80s and 90s, but that was very much the case that we encountered. And one of the analogies that I use in discussing populism, again, comes from the oil patch, is the concept of the wildcat well and the rogue well. You know, a wildcat well is a well that's drilled in an area that's not been very much explored, so you don't know what's down beneath it. It may be a dry well, a dry hole, but you may hit a gusher. And a rogue well is when you do hit a gusher, and there's so much energy there, and it's so unexpected, and it's so much more than what you thought, that it blows the platform off the wellhead and can catch on fire. Well, one of the worst rogue well, wildcat wells, or rogue well in the western oil patch was a year after Leduc near Edmonton, where a rogue well spilled 10 times the amount of oil that the Exxon Valdez spilled out. And it couldn't be controlled. There was so much energy there, valuable energy, worth millions of dollars, but out of control. So what do you do? One of the ways of doing it, now there was somebody in one of my audiences this morning said the oil patch has figured out how not to have this happen anymore. But in the old days when it did happen, one of the few ways you can control it was to drill a relief well in from the side. And the angle was extremely important. That's why it was very skillful who you got to drill the relief well. If it was too shallow, it wouldn't take off enough pressure, and it wouldn't take the pressure off the well. If it was too deep, the relief well could become a rogue well. But if it was at the right angle, it could take enough pressure off that you could install valves, bring the thing under control, and harness that energy to some useful purpose. And what we tried to do in the 80s and 90s, and many of you remember this, that there was anger in the West, political anger, and it was bottom-up anger. There was anger still over the National Energy Program, $100 billion worth of wealth transferred from this part of the country to the federal treasury, the consuming provinces. No wonder people were mad. There was a CF-18 decision in Winnipeg, where Winnipeg Company won a contract fair and square, and for political reasons was transferred to Quebec. There was the Mulroney government's inability to balance the budget when that's what Westerners thought they were going to do. People were mad. And so what we tried to do is say, you got a right to be mad. We went around and said, we're mad too. You got to identify with the thing that's causing the emotion. But then we'd say, but instead of kicking the Federation apart, like the Bloc Quebec was trying to do in Quebec, why don't we take this anger and energy and try to reform the Federation, try to decentralize it, let's balance the budget, let's get the Senate fixed. We had this whole list of things. And it took that energy and channeled it in a way that at least was not destructive, and of course I would argue it was constructive. So watching the populist phenomena, and it's going to grow again. There's discontent in the West at present, and that's going to have to be, I think, managed in such a way that it ends up being constructive rather than destructive. Now, a third phenomena, if we're just riding out in the political trail, has to do with millennials. And there's millennials in this room, which I'm very glad to see, in both Alberta and Saskatchewan in the next federal election. If the millennials, if you define them from 16 to 35, we always use the lower age because some of those will be able to vote in the 2020 election. If that group ever voted as a bloc, they would now be the biggest voting bloc in many jurisdictions. We did a survey through our center a year and a half ago of 2,200 millennials across the country. One of the questions that was asked on the survey was a traditional question the pollsters asked: where do you place yourself on the left, center, right spectrum? And one of the most frequent answers is, we don't like the axis. We don't like the spectrum. That left, center, right way is the way you all guys conceptualize politics. That's not how we conceptualize it. That does not describe our positions. It does not describe the options that we'd like to see in the public arena. And one of the reasons for millennial engagement is the fact that don't buy the conceptual framework in which so much politics is discussed. So what we tried to do with that was we started to put on millennial receptions. Mainly at our center in Calgary, but we would put on a few other places. And what we do is invite a bunch of millennials. We had 500 or 600 of them, but in small groups, 50 to 60 people. And we'd come into a room like this, and we had posters around the room with some different axes, not the left, right, center axis, but some different ones. And we had a democracy axis to say, do you like bottom-up decision-making by large numbers of people, or do you like experts, small group, professional, top-down decision-making on big issues? We had a trust axis. Who do you trust? Do you trust the big institutions, big government, big unions, big companies because they've got the power to do things, or do you trust small units, yourself, your family, your community, whatever? Where do you put yourself on the trust axis? On the environmental axis, do you think you can solve environmental problems through government regulation and things like that, or do you think it can be solved by market mechanisms like pricing mechanisms and so forth? We had 14 of these axes, and we give them these little stickums, say, go tell us where you are in this axis. And then towards the end of the evening, we'd say, now, we can't have 14 axes. If you had to reduce these to 3, what would they be? And then the last question we ask is, if you had to put a label on that space that you've now defined, what would the label be? Interesting thing on the labels, it's all over the map. But none of the labels were liberal, social democrat, socialist, or conservative. They were different. They weren't talking in that space. And now I think more of this kind of research has to be done. And it has to be done by someone other than us. Like our Manning Center is fairly closely identified with the conservative side of the spectrum. So if we do this, it's assumed that we've got a bias in that direction. But some think tank somewhere that is, or some academic group that is one step, not connected to the political parties and can't be accused of being connected to them, should redefine that political space. And I think if we don't do that, those millennials are either going to continue to be disengaged, or they could get caught up in one of these populist reactions. We don't like anybody. We know what we're against, but we don't know what we're for. And that would be an unfortunate thing to happen. Maybe one last frontier I'll touch on, and I'll stop, and we'll see if you've got some questions on any of this. On the social services frontier, we talked about this a little bit with some of the deputy ministers today. The 3 biggest areas, as you all know, of provincial government expenditures are health, education, and social assistance. it's consuming up to 2/3 of the budgets of some of the provinces. The healthcare budget in Quebec, the health budget alone is over 50%. And I think we're reaching the point of diminishing returns. There's a study done by the Montreal Economic Institute in Quebec where the majority of Quebecers do not believe another dollar spent on the healthcare system will improve the healthcare. It's past the point of diminishing returns. That's not trashing what's been done. That's not trashing the existing system, but it's saying it's reaching the end of its productivity. And one of the alternatives, therefore, is to start looking at, is there a need for a mixed system, public and private, in the social services sector, one that would give the consumer freedom of choice between public or private, and make the debate not whether it should all be one way or all the other, but what's the right balance between public and private resources in the social services sector. That's an issue that's going to have to be faced by a number of provincial governments, and I have a feeling that, particularly on the healthcare front, that's an issue where Saskatchewan could take the lead. Provinces that have had some skepticism about the original Medicare program, like Alberta, would be suspect if they start talking about this because, well, you guys never really did buy into it properly, so that's why you want more private. But if Saskatchewan, who is the father of Medicare, your motives in saying that this is fine, but we've got to move on to what the next model is, I think the credibility would be here. And that would be one of the challenges. Again, I'd ask who's going to champion the reinvention of the social welfare system, of the social safety nets, that's a better balance between public and private. They would be rendering a service to not just to this province, but to other provinces as well. Some of the other frontiers that I'll just mention by name, and if you wanted me to get into them, I will. One is the environmental frontier. I think every economic activity has negative environmental consequences. My own view is that we should then decide what measures will ameliorate or mitigate or avoid those measures. And then we have to decide how are you going to finance and implement those measures. Are you going to do it basically through government regulation, or are you going to do it through market mechanisms that harness the market to that challenge? That's one we could talk about. There's the technological frontier. And what I'd be interested in there is, I personally believe, I actually started in university in physics, and I told some group today I couldn't handle the math, so I went into economics. And because you can change the assumptions to make the math work in economics. Well, that's another subject. But if physics was the science of the 20th century, I think the biological and life sciences are going to be the sciences of the 21st century. And this development of these techniques for genetic engineering, for engineering and changing the genome of plants and animals and even people, I think is one of the most radical developments with an enormous potential for good. In a way, it's a new technology for doing what was done in the old days, done to convert rape to canola, but today that can be done in a laboratory, and you can change, well, they've done that with canola. They've made it drought resistant by genetic manipulation. They've made it disease resistant and so forth. And one of the questions that issue raises is how can you harness that technology to doing good in the agricultural sector, let's say, but not allowing it to do harm? Because those same technologies can be taken and used for negative purpose. They can be used for industrial sabotage. They can be used for biological warfare. I'm kind of getting on my speech on this thing, but for 1 year I taught a course at the University of Toronto, of all places, where I used to have a police escort to get on there. And it was on politics and the genetic revolution. Now, of course, you're going to say, what do you know about genetics? Well, not much. But I would invite in these geneticists that are doing this very advanced work on plants, on animals, and human genetics. And they would tell the students these wonderful things they're doing. They're trying to knock out the gene that causes these terrible inheritable diseases like Huntington's disease. They could knock the gene out, and it would prevent that from being passed on. But the last guy I used to bring in was Dr. Cam Boulay from the military biological side. And we used to call Cam Darth Vader, because he would come in, and Cam would say, you know, all those wonderful things those other people were telling you, there are people that will take that and apply it to the destructive of human life. And he had quite a lecture on it. Said there has not been a single scientific advancement, major scientific advancement in this world that has not been harnessed to the science of warfare. And don't think this one won't be. And today he'd say if a nutbar like that fellow that's running North Korea ever figured out how cheap it is to cause mass destruction by genetic manipulation of species, of viruses, of toxins, he wouldn't be spending billions on nuclear energy. He'd be spending it there. So this issue that this raises is how can we encourage that technology that has such enormous potential ramifications for agriculture, but not let it be that dark side. And then the last one I would maybe touch on is on the international frontier. I think we're in a contest in the 21st century with China, and the contest is this: state-directed capitalism versus market-directed capitalism, state-directed democracy versus citizen-directed democracy. And who's going to champion the Western version, which is more market-driven capitalism and citizen-directed democracy in the face of that competition? Okay, well, I've talked enough, so that's just some of the things I see on the frontier if we ride out there. And if you've got questions on the trade frontier, the resource frontier, the populist frontier, the millennial frontier, the social frontier, the environmental frontier, the technological frontier, the international frontier, I would be more than happy to try to answer them. Thank you very much.
Hi,
Yep.
my name's Louise. I've got a question for you. It's about the resource sector. When I was listening to you sort of in my mind, I was trying to file all the different resources from agriculture, mining, minerals, and whatnot. I was thinking about, you're really talking about form follows function. So do you think we should really start to focus on the function more and not the form? And I'll give you an example of a form. Pipelines is a form. Rail cars is a form. Trucking is a form. But if you think about the essence of where you start with, which is the function, you could figure out whether or not, should you be in this business or not, or what's the function of doing this before you get caught up in how you do it.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. This is sort of a different it's a different way of conceptualizing the economy than the traditional way or the way I suggested. And there might be merit in doing that. My worry about taking a functional approach to the economy, the model that is in the head of particularly the energy executives that I dealt with when I was in the consulting business, and this is an older generation, my generation, was a functional model of the economy. They think of the economy as it consists of extraction, processing, manufacturing, servicing, and consumption. And then there's that environment thing. But it was an add-on function. And I think this younger generation particularly have an integrated view of the economy and the environment that does not divide up the world that way, that says every economic function has an environmental impact. Every one of those does. And that's what we should figure out. What's the impact? How are we going to mitigate it? Who's going to pay for it? Are we going to use market mechanisms of regulation? But I hear what you're saying, and I'd have to think about that. Maybe there's other ways of conceptualizing the economy that would be more, you're searching for solutions by reconceptualizing it. So thank you.
Thank you.
A number of the topics you've raised have science at the core, and you've talked about some of the opportunities and some of the threats around science. One of the big challenges that science has in the public space is finding a way of having a conversation that respects the science but also respects the democratic elements that we require in our state. So how do you see that balancing, the impact of science on politics and politics on science in the context of the world?
Well, that's a great question. Well, I think it requires, sorry, I can't, I'm looking at the light. I think this requires an effort on both sides. I'm appalled by the lack of scientific knowledge on the part of the political class. Like every politician today has got this 5-minute speech on innovation. You prick below that, and in many cases, that's all there is. We have very little background. So I think there's a major effort, and I'm not being insulting to my political colleagues here. I'm talking about myself. I think a major effort has to, science, we're right when we say science is one of the huge driving, shaping forces of the world, but political people have got to get more up on it. And I think this, I was involved in helping to start this, or supporting at least, this Canadian Science Policy Conference, which is now quite a big conference in Ottawa. There's only a handful of political people at that thing. This is a thing that scientists are trying to put on to kind of discuss how science connects to everything else. There's no political people there. So I think a major effort has to be made by the political people. When the human genome was sequenced, I'm trying to think of one of the Canadian fellows, his name slips my mind, it shouldn't, Dr. Tom, who am I talking about? Anyway, a couple of us said, well, this is a pretty big scientific phenomenon. I was in the parliament at that time, so maybe we should get this fellow in to tell us what does it mean when they've sequenced the human genome. We took of the 300 members of parliament at that time, we figured out who's 100 that might be the most interested. And this is parliamentarians asking parliamentarians. It's not somebody outside trying to get them to come to a meeting. We contacted 100 of them, say Tom Hudson, Dr. Tom Hudson, because he was Canadian, was involved in the sequencing. We said, Tom's going to come in and give us an explanation of what this is all about and its ramifications. Of the 100 that we contacted, this is out of the 300, and we dismissed 200, 20 showed up at the meeting. I mean, this is one of the major scientific advancements of the 20th century, and 20 of them showed up. And now it was a good meeting, and Tom explained the whole thing and its importance in that, but the lack of interest was a worry to me. So I think a lot has to be done on the political side to get more involved with the science community. Now, on the other side, I'd say to the scientists, you got to do more to get in touch with the politicians. When I was a member of parliament for 9 years for Calgary Southwest, I was never met once in my constituency office by a scientist. Not once. I was met in Ottawa by them, and the only time they came to see me was to look for money. It was the only thing. And I understand that. But if you've got no relationship other than the relationship of the milking machine to the cow, that is hardly, you can't build a policy environment. You can't, when you do need the money, if you've got the relationship, it makes a difference. So I think there's a lot can be done by the scientists to get more engaged with the political. You notice at the political conventions, no scientists. Count the number of candidates on the federal arena in this last federal election from a science background or science background. You can count them on fingers of one hand. Again, I shouldn't get into stories, but when I was in Ottawa, there was an effort made by the Chalk River nuclear people to get financial support from the federal government for a neutron reactor. This is a reactor that produces a neutron beam that has a capacity not X-ray, but to get you a picture of the composition of a hard material better than anything else we had. Again, I called a whole bunch of MPs. I managed to get 3 or 4 of them to go up to Chalk River. That's all I could get to go up there. When we got there, we got this lovely presentation by a scientist, but I'll tell you what was wrong. This was a brilliant man. I'm not knocking him. But he started telling the story the way scientists like to talk. He started with the scientific method. He started with Physics 101. What is a neutron? What is a neutron beam? What is a neutron generator that generates the beam? How does it use it? He went through that. I could just see the guys looking at the ceiling. And then after he's gone through all this, he took us out into one of their laboratory areas and said that there's something we've looked at with this neutron thing that they were trying to develop. They didn't have the full thing. There's this. And he said, over there in the corner, there's the O-ring from the Saturn vehicle, the one that blew. It's like the one, you remember that Saturn vehicle that blew up because the O-ring? Now I talked to, not him, but the Chalk River communications people afterwards. Look, I don't know enough physics. I flunked physics in university. But I do know something about communication. If I was telling these people about the neutron thing, I would start at the other end. I would get them in a little briefing room, and I'd show them a picture, and I'd have one word on the screen, stress. I'd show a bridge collapsing. I'd show a building falling apart. I'd show that Saturn vehicle blowing up because the O-ring couldn't hold it together. And I'd say stress kills. Stress causes damage. Stress does terrible things. This thing we've got over in the laboratory is a way to look at molecules as to why don't they hold together when they should. And then I'd give them Physics 101. And I got them now from my story. Now I'll tell them. And I think there's a lot the science community can do to communicate the science in such a way that the political people will. So that's a great question. Something that political people have to do, something the science have to do. The thing I'd say to the students about these posters, and again, this is communication, and I find that all of those very fascinating. But one thing you got to know, if you're selling those concepts to a politician, the average, in my caucuses, my caucus could not see within 90 seconds, literally 90 seconds, how to communicate the thing you're trying to get them to do, you've lost them. That's a great idea, but I can't explain that. If I go out of this room and that CBC lady puts her mic in my face, if I can explain it and say it and tell the story or whatever it is, I'll buy it. But if I can't do that, I won't buy the idea, no matter how good it is. So putting these messages, science messages particularly, in their politically communicable form is very essential to bridging that gap between scientists and the politicians. Okay, talk too long on that. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Manning. Could you expand a little bit on your views on between carbon pricing and environmental regulation?
Well, yeah, and this is an area where I'm not quite on the same wavelength as a lot of my conservative friends, but the model that is in my head, and this is in the heads of younger people that have got the economy and the environment integrated, they don't see them as sequential. There's the economy, and then we got to figure out the environment. No, they're all tied up together. Is that for every economic activity, there's an environmental impact, some of which are negative. Does anybody deny that? I mean, the economy takes resources out of the environment and ultimately puts the products back in. And then if that's the case, and we're going to be environmentally responsible, then don't we have to say, okay, what are the measures that will avoid those negative impacts or mitigate them, and then how are we going to finance and implement those measures? One way is to keep trying to do it through regulation on top of regulation. The other is to incorporate the cost of the mitigative or avoidance measures in the price of the product. It's a market mechanism for dealing with that problem rather than a regulatory mechanism. Now, having said that, I think there's merit in that concept. I think the way that this carbon tax is being implemented by Ottawa, by Ontario, and Alberta is flawed. And so I would attack how it's being done, but I personally wouldn't attack the concept. And I'd say three things to make a carbon price work, if you think that's the way to do it, and some people don't. One is it should be revenue neutral, in my view, particularly when you've got an economy that's faltering. In other words, whatever it takes out of the economy for the carbon levy should be accompanied by a reduction in other taxes in other ways, so it's revenue neutral. None of these are. The Alberta one isn't. It's half, 50% of the revenue that's going into general revenue. The Ottawa one isn't. The Ontario one isn't. It should also be subsidy-free, because subsidies distort markets just as much as anything else. So you shouldn't be using that money to subsidize something else. And thirdly, if a pricing system is a substitute for regulation, it should be accompanied by a reduction in regulation. In Alberta, that bill that introduced the carbon price is 100 pages long. 95 pages of it is additional regulation in addition to setting up the carbon price. In a way, it indicates the government itself does not believe in the efficacy of its market mechanism because it's got regulation on top of it. So that's kind of the way I've been coming at that debate. And I know Saskatchewan's coming at it in a different way. There's other ways of mitigating and avoiding measures than by incorporating in the price. But that's kind of what I say to conservatives is, because what the Ottawa guys are doing, when the media come to and say, well, you're against the carbon price, how would you handle these negative environmental things? Their tendency is to say, well, we'd regulate them. Now here you got conservatives that are against regulation in 90% of the other areas, but saying regulation is the answer there. So there's a danger, I think, of getting into an ideological box by taking that position. But this is an area where I'll tell you one other funny story on that, and this goes back a long way. When Alberta passed its first environmental act, it was still the old Social Credit Administration in 1969 or 1970. The Edmonton Journal, the big southern newspaper in Edmonton, sponsored a dirty story contest. And you were supposed to find some irresponsible industry, preferably with a picture, belching smokestack or whatever, and write a 250-word essay on, and whoever had the dirtiest story won a prize. So I happen to know a couple of guys working in the basement of the Edmonton Journal. I said, get me two numbers. How much newsprint did they use per day? And how much of that black, in those days they used carbon ink, which had some other stuff in it that when you burned it, it produced about 3 different types of oxides that were poisonous. And so I took them to an unemployed chemist and say, work this back into the woods. That much paper, how much pulp, how much effluent in the river, how much biological oxygen demand on the stream, how much fiber left in the woods, work it all the way back, and work it back for 30 years. And then I said, work it the other way. Let's assume that product all gets oxidized. How much carbon monoxide, how much carbon dioxide, how much of those other oxides when you burn that carbon ink. And we got these horrendous numbers for 30. So I wrote it up in the story. I said, there's this innocent little factory on the banks of the North Saskatchewan that thinks it's pure as the driven snow. This is the pile of gunk that it is responsible for. And my moral was, physician, heal thyself. And then we gave it to the electronic media, because they had a field day with it at the journal's expense. And the journal canceled the contest. But the publisher was Ross Munro. Some of you remember Ross Munro was a great journalist. He was a wartime journalist. He was the publisher of the journal. He was a good guy. I wasn't trying to get at Ross. But anyway, he found out I was behind this. I was just a young guy, and he summoned me to his office. So I go to his office. There was nothing on his desk except one copy of the paper. And he didn't even say hello. He said, do you know what the advertising rates of this newspaper would have to be if we cleaned up half that stuff going back into the woods? And he said, do you know what the subscription rates of this paper would have to be if we cleaned up half of it going downstream? And I said, Ross, that's exactly right. Why don't you take your readers through exactly what you've said to me? Because that's the case for every enterprise. It's the case with the oil patch guys, with the farmers, with anybody else that tries to cope with there's a cost associated with that has to be integrated in the cost of the product, or unless you can get a subsidy from the government. And then I made one last mistake. I was in the consulting business. I said, Ross, for $50,000, we'll do a material balance study on the Edmonton Journal. And he threw me out of his office. But that's that concept again. See, that's that concept of figuring out what the environmental impacts are and figuring out how to finance it either through the market or through subsidies.
Thank you, Mr. Manning. I just have a quick question for you about sort of the current state of Western alienation. We're seeing a lot of issues as of late related to Trans Mountain, to grain transportation, to concerns around NAFTA negotiations. And I'm just wondering if you could shed some light in terms of sort of, like I said, the current state of Western alienation in Canada.
Well, yeah, I think it is growing because of the factors that you mentioned. I think there's a growing disillusionment that governments can't fix it, that politics can't fix it, which fits into this, then a pox on all their houses. And I'm not sure what the answer is. It's not reached the point that it did in the 80s or 90s yet, where it turned itself into a separatist movement, so you could target it at public meetings. You could target what the people that were angry thought the solution was. But I think it's something that has to be monitored, and that ultimately you have to try to come up with answers to the causes of those angers that are constructive rather than kicking it apart. One caution that I have with the Alberta fellows, and I guess this applies to Saskatchewan too, and you can see how we're being forced into this, that the federal government should intervene on this thing and get this Trans Mountain pipeline built. But if we're going to advocate that from a Western provincial standpoint, I think we want to be very careful in selecting the federal power under which we advocate that intervention. If you advocate, why don't you do it under the federal commerce power? Remember that power then can be used to do 100 other things than the Trans Mountain pipeline. If you say it should be done by declaring that pipeline to be a work to the advantage of Canada, which is Section 9210C allows you to do, watch that, because that gives the federal government power to regulate and intervene in transportation within your own province. there is that federal power that just allows the federal government to intervene on a connection between two provinces, which is probably the narrowest ground constitutionally for federal intervention in that case. And I think when we advocate why doesn't the federal government do so, let's be very careful on how we suggest that they should do that. That's an incomplete answer to a very complicated question. Okay, thank you very much.